wanted to have a short discussion about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Just to reflect upon what he's meant to us in this nation, and also just to, think about his life a little bit. I know here with the anniversary of his assassination, we've all had an opportunity to reflect, and I don't think that any one conversation can really encapsulate all that he's really meant to us. But, as a young black male, I think that it's absolutely essential that I take into account, the fact that I would not necessarily have as many opportunities, as I have right now if it weren't for people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And certainly there were many others in the fight, and there were many others that stood in the gap and took beatings and were sprayed with fire hoses and bitten by police dogs and lynched just so that I can be doing what I'm doing today. And so I want to have this conversation not to make light or to neglect to mention anyone else, but certainly as a forerunner of the civil rights movement, and not even just civil rights, but he stood for a lot of things. I think it's just necessary to have a short discussion about him. Dr. Martin Luther King, very, very important man. Obviously, that goes without saying. I'm a little concerned in this day and age because most of us don't really know much about him, and it's partially because I'm part of the generation that came after his life. And that, of course, notwithstanding the fact that schools don't necessarily take the time to teach in depth about his life and about the things that he endured, the things that he accomplished. I still have to learn a little bit about him, and so it's a matter of picking up a book, learning on my own, and certainly worthwhile, especially with this man. Dr. Martin Luther King, stands out to me as a man who gave it all just to see somebody like me be able to have opportunities that he didn't have. And by giving it all, what I mean by that is simply that we're talking about a scholar. We're not talking about somebody who, got a 6th grade education and, because they couldn't get the top ranking spot on the plantation picking cotton, that they decided to complain. No, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a man who had 2 bachelor's degrees and a PhD. This was the kind of man who could have simply moved, he and his family, to the West Coast, maybe California somewhere, and could have lived in a better situation than living in the South, could have gotten a pretty good job, bought a house where he could have been separated from the problems of the South. And I say that not to imply that there weren't problems elsewhere, but rather to make clear that there were some places in the U.S. that were a little bit worse than others. Be that as it may, he decided to stay in the South and devote himself completely to the cause. And, he died broke. We're talking again about a man who had 3 degrees, 2 bachelor's degrees and a PhD. And he died broke because he gave everything that he had to make sure that somebody like me could be doing what I'm doing today. Now, this becomes particularly important because in the black community, we have a few leaders, and most of those leaders come from the church, as was the case with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Yet, when we look at the leaders of today, it's clear that the level of devotion that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Presented and exhibited is not anything that we see today. All right, we have preachers that are leaders, but that are clearly only concerned about their own well-being. As long as they can afford the mansion, as long as they can, wear the nice clothes, and as long as they're driving the Bentley coupes, they're okay. But as it relates to standing up for issues that actually affect not just even the African American community, but the U.S. as a whole, we don't see much of that involvement. And that's something that made Dr. King special, because he wasn't concerned about living in a house on the hill and separating himself from the problem and simply saying, oh, well, that's their problem, I don't live over there, that's for them to be concerned about. No, he was concerned. Dr. King was concerned. And even when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, the cash prize that came along with that, he devoted to the cause. And to me, it's just amazing that a man could could give his life. And even toward the end of his life, he spoke prophetically that he knew that he would not be around to see the progress, but he encouraged that we continue to fight. And to me, that just says a lot about the character of this man, because he could have lived a much easier life. He simply could have, and I don't think many people would have blamed him for doing so. Interestingly enough, and one thing that I've was particularly surprised about when I learned about Dr. King was that unlike what we see today, today we have a general admiration for the man, and in particular, even in the black community, we hold him in very, very high regard. But such was not the case when he was alive. In fact, it would be fair to say that many black people, I'm talking about even people in the church, were against what Dr. King was attempting to accomplish. They saw him as a rebel and a troublemaker, one that they simply wanted to be quiet, because they saw him as being someone who could potentially make a difficult situation even worse. And so they were absolutely against him. And so you can imagine the sort of odds that he and all of the others in the movement were facing when they were not only facing segregationalists, the whites in the South and elsewhere that were content and were aimed at maintaining segregation, but they also had to face resistance within their own communities. And this is exactly what Dr. King had to face. And this was not a joke at all. I mean, this was some serious resistance. All right, you can imagine every time that they would set up a rally or a boycott or anything like that, there would be people in the community that would snitch on them and tell the police and tell the government, okay, they're setting up a boycott, they're planning a march. They couldn't literally do anything without having some resistance. Nevertheless, they continued to fight. And Dr. King, along with the others, were not deterred. Even though they had to face resistance among the people that you would probably guess should have been on their side, they continued to fight. And it's because of that this country is what it is today. And obviously we still have a lot of work to do, but again, just an amazing man whose life exemplified what it means to sacrifice for the greater good.